I think for many reasons this kind of interaction is important to me. Of course, with working with the UN, one gets exposure to the Council and to the General Assembly and so forth. But I think it's very important that we as South Africans and we as people from the continent, that we also see ourselves as participants in the international debates. So it's one thing to think about human rights and international law as a set of universal standards that's applicable to everyone. But I think it's the second thing is really to say that all of us should contribute. If it's truly universal, all of us should really contribute towards what that is. And from the South African point of view, of course, Navi Pillay was the High Commissioner for Human Rights now. She's just retired. Within the special procedures, there are a number of people from South Africa, from Africa. And I really want to encourage you to also think about engagement with these issues. It's a pleasure to be here with Henny as well. He's been a friend on different continents, one of the leading scholars of international law from South Africa, and it's also a pleasure really to see the chair, or the seat of the chair, here today. So I believe we have about an hour, and I want to talk about new technologies. If our technology helps, then I'll show you a little bit of the kind of material that we're dealing with. But perhaps to start off, to some extent, just with almost where does it come from? So if we say that today, and what I want to talk about is unmanned systems, unmanned weapon systems. But where does this really come from? And I think what is a useful starting point is what the military people call revolutions in military affairs, RMAs. And they've identified something like 11 or so of those times when there's a complete paradigm shift in the way that force is used. So if we start off with sticks and stones and people hitting each other, but then getting to spears and getting to bows, crossbows and longbows, and getting to the use of gunpowder, mechanized power through tanks, and also, of course, going to nuclear, and introduction of aerial power really along the way as well. These are a series of revolutions in military affairs, new ways of using force. But all of them involved a warrior, a soldier, using a weapon in a certain way. And the weapon becomes stronger. So as these weapons developed, it was possible for the warrior to have more distance from the target. And of course that's quite attractive, because if you are in close combat, you are also in harm's way. If you can actually project force across the horizon and have standoff weapons, you are likely to, or more likely, to get out of it unscathed. Of course, if the other side have it, you've got the sort of arms race kind of situation. But with all of these revolutions in military affairs, the relationship between the weapon and the warrior remained the same, is the warrior decides when to use the weapon. What we now have with the new technology is the introduction of so-called unmanned systems. So there is no pilot on board. There is nobody in the cockpit, either of a plane or of a land vehicle or of a surface vehicle on the water or of a submarine. It is in the first instance, in the first manifestation, it is remote controlled. And I think we've all heard about drones. And so drones, there are two kinds of drones. One is reconnaissance drones, and we're not talking about those. They create their own problems, of course. Reconnaissance drones, what sort of problems do they create, do you think? If you have a plane, a helicopter, it costs $300. You have a helicopter with a camera on it, and it goes around and it films houses, for example. What sort of issues do you think will come up? Privacy, we saw, say, with Nelson Mandela, when he was in hospital, there was a drone flying over, trying to go through the window. You can imagine yourself in the bathroom or something and seeing a drone outside. It creates privacy issues. Those are real issues. It has real advantages as well, because it means that you don't need a real helicopter. You can use reconnaissance drones to protect the environment, fires, to patrol the coast, all of those things. But that's a whole separate category. Let us put that aside, and the privacy issues that come up, we put that aside, and we focus simply on the kinds of drones that can use force. Armed drones, military drones, in other words. So it is a remote controlled system. There's a pilot sitting, and they've got a computer. They've typically got a whole range of computers there. There are at least 3 people there, and there's a JAG officer, a legal officer as well. And somebody controls the navigation, and there's somebody pressing the button. And if the technology works, we'll show you some of the instances of how drones hit people. So this is an unmanned system, but there's no pilot on board. The second form of unmanned system that I want to talk about is what is called autonomous weapon systems. There are different names for it. Some call it killer robots, some call it lethal autonomous robots, and so forth. Let's talk about autonomous weapon systems. This is also a form of unmanned system. There's no one on board, but it's not remote controlled. There's not a pilot sitting in Creech military base and pressing that button and decides that somebody's going to die. And now how do they do it with autonomous weapon systems? They have a computer on board. So there's a computer, and that computer identifies either with facial recognition or based on a pattern of life, a behavior, somebody loading weapons onto a truck or using a weapon, identify the target, or it could be a tank or tanks in a desert, for example, in an area. You know your own tanks, the friendly tanks, you've got GPS coordinates for all of them, and you program the computer to say destroy enemy tanks in this particular radius. Or where it's particularly popular and in the terms of technology developing is underwater, because underwater you cannot remotely control because the signal doesn't go through water. So it's especially popular with that, but it's popular in different ways, popular in the sense that the technology is moving in that direction. So if the broad category that we're talking about is unmanned systems, we can say that revolutions in military affairs have over the years given the warrior more power through the weapons that this warrior used. Traditionally, the warrior takes the decision. The new development with autonomous systems really creates a complete new paradigm. With unmanned systems, with drones, the pilot is removed from the battlefield altogether. You're halfway around the world. So the force becomes depersonalized. It's no longer a human being who's there on the other side and that person engages with you in conflict. That's what happens with drones. That's the first step. The pilot is physically removed from the battlefield. With autonomous weapon systems, it's not only that the pilot is physically removed from the battlefield, but also psychologically. The pilot is not present. There is no pilot. It's a computer taking the decision. So in a way, what we saw with earlier revolutions in military affairs is that the relationship between the warrior and the weapon was that the weapon became more powerful in the hands of the warrior. But now we have a situation where the weapon, in a way, becomes the warrior. The weapon takes the decision when to release force. And that is the crucial distinction, I think, that is happening at the moment, is that the decision-making is delegated, if you want to use the word, by human beings to machines. And of course that raises a whole host of questions. What sort of questions do you think will this raise? What comes to your mind when you think about autonomous force delivery? What would you see as the main issues there?
The attribution of criminal responsibility.
In what sense?
If probably a drone or an unmanned drone strikes an area illegally, who is to be held responsible for deaths of individuals or unarmed people? Yeah,
absolutely. But let's make the distinction with a drone. If we talk about a drone as an armed drone, which is remote controlled, that problem doesn't really arise there, is it? Because you know who the pilot was. You know the drone pilot was the person pressing the button. But it arises with autonomous weapon systems, the issue of responsibility. Who is responsible? So what could be a solution to this issue of responsibility? If you have an autonomous weapon system, who can you potentially hold accountable?
Manufacturers.
Manufacturers is one of the possibilities, no? But that's going very far upstream.
It's like Chrysler, something goes wrong with their airbags.
Yeah, it's like almost a form of product liability that you can say. But that's the concept of product liability is not known within this context, within armed conflict. But that's one of the possibilities. The programmers, Who else could be potentially responsible? The politicians, yeah?
I think also the state.
The state?
Own the drone.
Yeah, so it's not just criminal responsibility, there's the possibility of state responsibility. You can actually make a distinction between individual accountability and then impersonal accountability. It can be a corporation, for example, you can even have corporate criminal responsibility, and state responsibility for the state that bought and used these weapon systems. So you can go further upstream. Of course, the politicians, but the commander as well. Because the definition of autonomous weapon system is a weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further human intervention. Now, of course, that tells you that there must be somebody who activates it. So the commander who decides to do that. And you can potentially look at something like command responsibility, according to some authors. Of course, there are problems with that as well. So, but in principle, they say if a commander can be held accountable for his or her subordinates' behavior, if you have a commander deciding to use an autonomous weapon system, that person can be held accountable for the autonomous weapon system in the same way. There are all kinds of problems with that, because command responsibility is really based on the idea that you command and control the particular soldiers you've involved in their training, and in the end you are held accountable for this. But if we are talking about truly autonomous systems that take their own decisions, it becomes a problem whether one can have command responsibility. But indeed, that's one of the first problems that come up with autonomous weapon systems. Who is responsible for that? That problem does not come up in the same way with drones. There may be also with drones, it may be everybody who is involved. Is it simply the person who presses the button? But at least there you can identify more clearly the humans involved. So there's really sort of three positions that perhaps should be distinguished. One is where there's a human in the loop, and that is a human takes the decision. That's a drone operator presses the button. On the other extreme, the human is out of the loop. There is no human that takes that final decision whether to use force. And then there's a middle position where the human is on the loop. And that is where you have a weapon system. We can leave that if it doesn't work. Where you have a weapon system that takes some decisions, but you have the power to override it. All right? So because warfare is becoming faster and faster, you may have a situation where the computer decides whom to target, and it's going to actually hit that person, but you as an individual have the possibility to press the stop button, the delete button, or the abort button. So that's the human on the loop. So it's human in the loop, that's a drone, human out of the loop, autonomous weapon system, and then somewhere in between, a human on the loop kind of situation. Do you see a problem with the human on the loop kind of situation? Do you think is that perhaps the solution? We should, for all these systems, should somewhere, there must be somebody checking it on a computer that works like this one, and you can actually press the escape button there. Will that solve the problem? Any ideas?
Too much human error?
Sorry?
Too much potential for human error?
Human error, but also it's just too fast, isn't it? And that's the very reason why they're taking us out of the loop, is because we're too slow. You know, for the pace of warfare, they're taking humans out of the cockpit because of what is called force protection. You don't want your soldiers to die. And that's of course very understandable, and that's actually a very important point to keep in mind, is that every single military in the world that I know of will prefer an option where their own soldiers are not at risk. So in terms of the numbers, if you look at modern militaries, all of them, in terms of their new budget, are moving in the direction of fewer people on board in terms of using drones. Autonomous weapons is a new field. There is no state in the world at the moment that uses autonomous weapons against other human beings. They do use it machine against machine. So incoming munitions, if you have the Aegis system, for example, on a flight deck ship, and there's a mortar coming in or a missile coming in, automatically it shoots something like 2,400 rounds per minute, and it just completely pulverizes the incoming munition. But they're not using it against human beings. So drones have killed thousands of people. Autonomous weapons have been used against other weapons. And now the question is, we're on the cusp where these technologies are being developed. The Tyrannus, and I'll show you a picture of the Tyrannus X-47B, where they can actually be used also against human beings. But that is where we are at the moment. So if we talk about definitions, just to make sure what we're talking about, again, we're talking about unmanned systems, a system where there is no human on board, and there are two generations of this. The first is now maybe 15 years old in terms of its large-scale use. The first person to be hit was actually 2002, so maybe it's say 12 years old. 2002 in Yemen, the first person to be hit with the current technology under drones, and that's remote control. It's unmanned, remote controlled. Unmanned system, autonomous weapon is where it's not remote controlled. There is not a human in the loop, in the direct decision-making loop. It's a computer taking that sort of decision. That has not been used against human beings, but we are at the point where the international community has to decide, and where I think most people agree that if it's left to its own devices, the technology is left to its own devices, then that's probably what we're going to get. And precisely because of the move from drones to autonomous weapon systems, precisely because of the issue of speed, autonomous weapon system can process information just much faster and come to a decision, and also because of the problems of communications. With drones, you always need communications, and communications can be scrambled. Communications can be used to trace the source. So you are sitting somewhere in a container, and you are using a computer. Signal goes out, it controls a drone. The enemy can pick up that signal, trace it back, and because you're participating in hostilities, they can target you as well. And as I've mentioned, communications underwater, very difficult. And for that reason, the move, at least by the highly industrialized nations, and the leaders, at least as far as we know, with many of these things we don't really know, but the ones who are on record as developing what can be used potentially in autonomous mode are certainly the US and the UK. And then there are a number of other places where these robots are also used, but they haven't been used against human beings yet. So for example, in Gaza, in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, they have robots that patrol a certain area, say 100 meters around it. And if it picks up a human by body heat, a certain weight that they can determine that it's not just a small animal, it's a human being within a demilitarized zone, then it goes back to a computer, but that computer can be switched over into the way in which it's being used at the moment. It goes to a computer, all kinds of lights go on and sounds and so on, and the human presses the button. That's a human in the loop who then presses the button. But it's a question of switching it over into autonomous mode, and that's not very difficult. It's almost like a landmine in a way, isn't it? That you identify, you pick up the infrared signals, and that translates into a weapon being triggered and then clearing whatever is in that particular area. So we are moving in that direction, but we haven't really applied autonomous weapons, at least fully autonomous weapons, against human beings in military conflict yet. So that's the first sort of category that I want to talk about, the military use of unmanned systems in these two manifestations. And I think we have the basic outlines of at least what the issue is there. The second component, if there's time, that I want to at least mention to you, I don't think we'll have the time to go into it, but it's the use of these same technologies in the law enforcement context. Now, of course, if you have remote control and you have autonomous weapons in the military context, the very same people who manufacture the weapons for military use are the same people often who manufacture weapons that can potentially be used in law enforcement, so outside of the context of armed conflict. And the question is, are we going to get drones that are used then by the police going out to control a crowd, for example? And if you Google skunk, South Africa, a company manufacturing a drone that can be used in law enforcement, and they advertise it as something that can be used if you've got demonstrations. And what they actually say there is, if you have Marikana, this was asked before we started, they say we don't want another Marikana, so we want a drone that can, and these are weapon platforms. They can be fitted with anything. They can be fitted with a rifle. They can be fitted, like with the military use, they can be fitted with a missile. They can be fitted with, in the case of law enforcement, with less lethal weapons. So the skunk, for example, typically will come with tear gas. And the skunk can be used, and you put it over a crowd, and if you want to disperse the crowd, you press the button and the tear gas comes out. There are also semi-autonomous variations of that. So you put up a weapon, say at a barrier that you create, and that barrier picks up human heat, for example, and as soon as that happens, it releases tear gas. Those very same platforms can be used with shotguns, can be used with tasers, these electric devices that provides high level shock to the individual. So all kinds of other less lethal or lethal weapons can be used in the law enforcement context by using these weapon platforms as well. So let's leave that aside for a moment, and let's get back to the main thing that I think is the use of unmanned systems in a military kind of context, which can be a traditional military conflict, but we know that typically what we have today, and all the contexts where drones are used, are non-international armed conflicts. Either non-international armed conflict, or perhaps in some cases, situations that do not meet the requirements of non-international armed conflicts. So in other words, situations that should not really be dealt with under international humanitarian law. But in the broader anti-terrorism kind of mindset, they see that as part of military action. But from a legal point of view, of course, the importance is not, does the state see this as a non-international armed conflict or not? It's an objective question. Does it meet the requirements of a non-international armed conflict? And if it does not meet the requirements of a non-international armed conflict, then of course it should be regulated through human rights law, like a law enforcement kind of situation. So let us think, if we confine ourselves to the military use of unmanned systems, what are the potential legal, and I want to ask you this, what are the potential legal regimes that are applicable to the use of force, say in the typical anti-terrorism kind of activity that you may find in Pakistan, for example, or that you may find in Somalia or Yemen? But let's focus on Pakistan. What would be the legal regimes that are applicable to the potential use of unmanned systems? And perhaps we can focus for the time being, because autonomous weapons have not been used there. Let's focus on the use of armed drones in a country such as Pakistan. What in terms of international law, what are the legal regimes that are potentially applicable there? Any ideas?
International criminal law.
International criminal law can certainly play a role. Yeah.
International human rights law.
Human rights. In what case will human rights law play a role?
The victims, more the principle of proportionality, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure actually.
Okay, but you're right. International human rights law, yes.
International human rights law. In that context, the right to life, for example, would apply.
For sure.
In this particular case, if you target a particular individual by way of these drones, and so you'll be violating the Article 6,
Yeah.
SCPR, Article 4.
Article 6, the right to life. Yeah.
Right to life. So
Okay, so yes, potentially human rights law can play a role, and the part of human rights law that plays a role is the right to life. Certainly the most likely one to play a role. Yeah.
International humanitarian law, both use in bellow and use under.
Okay, but let's both those. So humanitarian law, and then the whole question of so use in bello, and the whole question of use ad bellum.
Yes.
So let's make the distinction between these. These are the four legal regimes that are potentially applicable. So the first question is the one, and let's make the distinction between what is it that you're trying to protect, because I find that as a useful sort of starting point then to fit in the different legal regimes that are applicable. As far as you want to protect sovereignty, the use ad bellum is the determining legal regime. the law on the interstate use of force. That's Article 2.4 of the Charter, and of course custom as well, which says that you cannot use force against another state, except in 3 circumstances, which are some of them in the Charter and some not. Under what circumstances can you use force against another state? Self-defense, Article 51.
Collective security.
If it's under Chapter 7, so the Security Council says you can use it, yes. And when else can you use force? Consent, if the state consents. That's not directly in the Charter, but that's accepted as well. There's a 4th one, which some states say you have, and some academics say that where you can use force as well. What would that be?
Preemptive self-defense.
Well, let's keep self-defense, which can be preemptive, and there are different opinions on to what extent it can be anticipatory or preemptive. But there's a whole separate category as well where states say you can, where some states say, and some academics say, and NGOs in particular say you can use force.
Humanitarian intervention?
Humanitarian intervention. That's controversial. So let's put that one aside. That's not, maybe with ISIS, it's something that can come in now. But the first legal regime is the use ad bellum. When are you allowed to use force against which may infringe on the sovereignty of another state? And that's the law on the use of interstate state force. So obviously this comes into play when you want to use a drone in another country, and we'll come back to that. Let's just first sort out the legal regime. So the first thing is, if you want to protect sovereignty and territory, that is being protected by the use ad bellum, the use of interstate force, the prohibition on the use of interstate force, except if you have those 3 exceptions that we've referred to. The thing that you want to protect there is state sovereignty, that the state can say, we control what happens in our territory, and you can't simply come in and come and use force there. The second category of protection that you want to give is protection to people. The first case that we talked about is protection of territory, sovereignty. In the second place, you want to protect people as well. And the other 3 legal regimes that you've mentioned protect people. So as far as the protection of individuals against the use of force is concerned, it can either be human rights. In fact, human rights apply all the time. It applies during armed conflict, it applies outside of armed conflict, it always applies. So human rights law always applies. But in the case of if you really have an armed conflict, and we're talking about a non-international armed conflict here, what are the conditions for a non-international armed conflict? When do we meet what is called the threshold of a non-international armed conflict? What are the 2 main conditions there? So if we come back to the example of Pakistan and Afghanistan, as you know, next to each other. So in the northwest of Pakistan is Waziristan, FATA, the tribal territories. That's on the border with Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we have a non-international armed conflict. It's a conflict between a state and a non-state actor, the Taliban. So it's the government of Afghanistan and the government of the US, and they're fighting against the Taliban. It's a non-international armed conflict. That's clear. That's a non-international armed conflict because they meet the requirements of a non-international armed conflict, which is there must be a certain intensity of violence, and there's for sure intensity of violence in Afghanistan, and there must be a certain level of organization. The Taliban is organized enough to be considered a non-state actor, and so we have a non-international armed conflict there. So in that case, we have human rights, which always applies, and then human rights is supplemented by international humanitarian law. In fact, as far as the right to life is concerned, human rights is understood in terms of humanitarian law. And that makes it very easy to use force, isn't it? If you meet the requirements, if you can say we are now dealing in Afghanistan with a non-international armed conflict, it is an AC, it's an armed conflict, then you can say the state can use force against anyone who is a legitimate target, even if that person is asleep. At night they can come and bomb the person anytime, any place. If it's a legitimate target, they can use force against that individual. So the threshold for the use of force is very low. So if you send a drone into Afghanistan, as they do, and they use it there, they can use it legitimately against any of the legitimate targets in that particular state, whether they're asleep or not. But if you cross the border into Pakistan, there's the question, are we dealing with an armed conflict? Are we dealing with an armed conflict in Pakistan? So, say in the far east of Pakistan, I think very few people will say we are really dealing with an armed conflict there. There's a grey area in Waziristan on the border because there may be a spillover from Afghanistan, and those borders are, as we know with many of the borders, are the results of colonialism or the results of the ends of war, and it's a very porous border where the conflict can go over. So maybe there's a question about, and I think many people will say there is a spillover effect of armed conflict into the Waziristan area of Pakistan. But many of the other areas in Pakistan, we're not sure that there is really an armed conflict, and many people will say there is not an armed conflict. If there's not an armed conflict, what is the legal regime that protects people in that part of Pakistan?
Human rights.
It's human rights law without IHL. So the crucial point is that if there's an armed conflict, then IHL applies, and it makes it very easy to use force. There are some restrictions, but you don't need an imminent attack. You can use force against somebody who's sleeping in such a particular case. But if there is not an armed conflict, then human rights standards apply. And there you need an imminent attack. You can only use force, and you can only use lethal force, if it is the only way of protecting life. So you can only take life in order to save life in such a case. Much more difficult to use force in such a situation. Now, if that is the starting point, then obviously a state wanting to use a drone will have an interest, or using force in any way, will have an interest in saying that we are dealing with an armed conflict. If they're talking about Afghanistan, it's very easy for them to say it's an armed conflict. I think most people will agree it's an armed conflict. If it's in Pakistan, if you want to use force, you're going to say we have an armed conflict in the country, and anywhere in the country, we are allowed to use the lower threshold of the use of force of IHL because it's an armed conflict. If there's not an armed conflict, you can't use IHL. And that's, of course, the ones who want to criticize them are going to say, but this is not an armed conflict. You are hitting somebody in the middle of Pakistan without a link to an established armed conflict. Yes, this person may be a member of Al-Qaeda or whatever the case may be, but this person doesn't have a link with the established armed conflict. You're not allowed to use drones. And most of the debate about drones and the use of drones turns on this point. Are we dealing with an armed conflict, or are we not dealing with an armed conflict in that particular situation? And the Americans and others who use drones have an expansive definition of an armed conflict. In fact, the traditional approach was to say there's a global war on terror. You remember those phrases? CNN even had the global war. CNN took it off when they saw that it became controversial. But a global war on terror. And that really means it's not only, forget Pakistan, it is anywhere where you find an enemy, somebody who is a legitimate target, who's directly participating in hostilities, or maybe have a continuing combat function. In fact, the definition was broader. Anybody who's seen as a member of Al-Qaeda or associated forces, which makes it much broader, that person can be targeted. Now, what are the consequences of that? If you can target somebody anywhere in the world at any time under the rules of IHL, the implications are, of course, that with IHL comes the concept of collateral damage as well. So if somebody's on a plane somewhere, as an Al-Qaeda member, and you or me happen to be on that plane as well, if this is a high-value target, if there is such a concept as a global war on terror, you can target that particular individual and we become collateral damage. You know the story about the plane, and somebody said, well, are you scared of flying? He said, no, if it's my time to die, then it's my time to die. The other guy said, well, but what if it's not your time to die, but it's the guy next to you whose turn it is to die, and you are on that same sort of plane. So there's, if the Americans, to put it very bluntly, have the right to target people anywhere in the world because they are considered to be enemy combatants, and the rest is collateral damage if it's not excessive, then of course if there's a Chechnyan rebel somewhere on an aeroplane in the US, in Chicago, or whatever the case may be, then the same rules should apply from that side as well. And so this whole idea of a global war on terror is something which expands the scope of the use of force very dramatically. And that's really what the debate was about then, is do we have a global war on terror? Do we have something which is confined to a particular space? And the reason why this is such a strong debate is because with IHL, you can target a legitimate target anywhere, anytime. And with human rights, you need to meet the requirements of human rights, which is proportionality, necessity, as understood in the context of human rights law. There, of course, and this is often very confusing, the same terms are used in humanitarian law and used in human rights law. With human rights law, necessity means that there must, really it's like a ladder, you must climb up the ladder, you must use a graduated force, you must use as little force as possible. In fact, the starting point of human rights law is you shouldn't kill. It's the exception that you should kill. So the rule is that you must capture. It's very different with international humanitarian law. One can almost say it's the other way around. With humanitarian law, it's the rule is that you can kill. Some people are now arguing, yes, if you can capture, that's a good thing. In some cases, you may need to do that. But it's almost the opposite. There's a right to life under human rights law and a right to kill under IHL. As some people, it's a bit exaggerated, but I think it's a conceptual framework that one can use. So with human rights law, it must be necessary. So it's a ladder, and it must be proportionate. There must be a balance between the interest that you attack and the interest that you want to protect. And in the case of life, you can only take one life in order to protect another life. Proportionality with human rights law requires that life may be taken only in order to protect life. So it's very conservative, so to speak, in terms of the use of force under human rights law. With IHL, you can use force. What are the requirements of IHL? Distinction. You must distinguish between or discriminate, as it's sometimes called. This is not a term that is popular, I think, in South Africa, to say you must discriminate, but in this particular case, you must discriminate between a legitimate target and typically a civilian. So you may never target a civilian specifically. That's the first rule of humanitarian law. The second one is proportionality. And that says that if you target a particular legitimate target, but there's collateral damage, as long as it's not excessive in terms of the military necessity, that's acceptable. Human rights law doesn't know this concept of collateral damage. It's something which is specific to IHL. So if your legal regime, applicable legal regime is IHL, it's much more permissive, both in terms of who you can target and in terms of the collateral damage that you may cause in such a case. And that's why states who use drones want to say this is an IHL kind of situation, and states who are against that, and NGOs and UN officials and special rapporteurs and so on, who are worried about the use of drones, are more inclined to say we must be very careful about whether we're dealing with an armed conflict or not. Okay, and what are the requirements for an armed conflict to give a state this level of ability to use force under IHL? There are two main requirements. I've already alluded to them, but let's just put it on the table again. What are the requirements before a particular situation can be seen as an armed conflict?
Once the owner of the party, if not the state party, must be an organized armed group.
Yes.
And the level of the conflict must meet a certain threshold.
Threshold, exactly. Yeah. And that's an objective test. It's you often hear people talking about this is not a declared armed conflict. That's not the test. That's the language people use. The test is not whether the state thinks it's a declared armed conflict, because states will in many cases say this is an armed conflict because they want to use force. In other cases, Mexico, for example, the number of people killed in Mexico since 2006 is more than 100,000 people in terms of the narco wars that they have. That's by all understandings of armed conflict is really an armed conflict, but the states don't want to think about it in that way. They don't want to say that it's out of control. So in some cases, states sort of underplay the presence of an armed conflict. In other cases, they overplay it. But in the drones context, typically they overplay it by saying this is an armed conflict, we are now allowed to use an armed conflict. So let's go back to the scheme that we have. In order to protect sovereignty, we have the law on interstate use of force ad bellum, and then in order to protect people, we have either human rights law on its own, or human rights law and IHL, but in the armed conflict. But the human rights is then understood in terms of IHL, so that's the lex specialis, that's the dominant legal system. And that depends on whether we're dealing with an armed conflict or not. So the four legal regimes are the use ad bellum, then the use in bello or human rights, and then what you mentioned, criminal law, is an additional part of protecting people. Because the right to life really has two components. One is the conditions under which force may be used against a particular individual, and the second component is accountability. And that's why international criminal law is part of what protects individuals there as well. So potentially that plays a role as well. So that's the broad, the legal regime categories that are applicable. And then I think the important question is, how do we apply this to drones? And we have very little time for that. Do we have another 10 minutes?
Yeah,
So, yeah. Okay. How do we apply these legal regimes to drones? And then let's see whether we can also say something about how it applies to autonomous weapon systems. So first, the question of the interstate use of force. How do drones affect the interstate use of force? And the underlying question that I think we should keep in mind is, are drones unlawful weapons? Or should they be regarded as unlawful weapons? Should autonomous weapons be regarded as unlawful weapons? And then in the second place, one should ask the question, if drones are not unlawful weapons, what is it that we are focusing on? What is the problem that we have with drones? Is it their use? And I think most people, and you'll certainly see in my reports that's the approach I take, is to say that drones are not unlawful weapons in themselves. And that's a position that's criticized by some NGOs, even some particular states would come and say, why do you so easily say that drones are not unlawful weapons? Well, let's interrogate it a little bit. But my position is that drones are not in themselves unlawful weapons, but the use of drones is problematic, and it can very easily be in violation of one of these legal regimes that we've identified. Now, why do I say drones are not unlawful weapons? It's very tempting to do so because drones create huge problems. And so one of the reactions I think that we have is to say, well, if a particular weapon creates a problem, we must ban it. But I think we must also be realistic about it. If a state uses a M16 and it flies at the speed higher than sound, at say 30,000 feet, and it drops a bomb through a cloud cover, it's a pilot who presses the button in that plane going over. What is the real difference what is the principal difference between a pilot sitting there in the plane, pressing the button, releases the bombs, the Hellfire missile is coordinated by GPS and it finds its target, or if that pilot is not in the plane but sits on the ground and has a television screen in front of him or her and presses the button on the ground? Is it really in principle different that the pilot is outside of the aeroplane? If we acknowledge that in an F-16 almost everything is done by computer in any event, and now the only thing is this person sits on the ground in front of the computer and presses that button. This is a contested concept. Some people say there's a difference. And they say that drones in themselves should be unlawful. But how would you see it? Is there really a difference between those two kind of situations?
I don't think that there is a difference, because what should we look at it is the action or the end of the action. You are sitting outside, pressing, sending them aside, and the one on board pressing the same thing, doing the same action. So I think there is no actually different. When we look at the action, that these two people differently will do.
Perhaps what you're saying is one can almost take further, is to say that there's a human in the loop in both cases. There's a human in the cockpit and he presses the button, and there's a human on the ground pressing the button. So there's not the concern about machines taking decisions here. It's a human taking the decision. And then some people argue, of course, that if you sit in front of a computer and there's a drone somewhere, and you can look at the screen, you are 30 centimeters away from the action. Whereas if you're at 30,000 feet, you can't see anything. So you're actually much closer. You're sitting halfway around the world physically, but in terms of being able to take a decision, you have a much clearer view than a pilot could have. That's pushing it in further in the direction that you put. But is there something on the other side, to be said on the other side, that there may be perhaps indeed be a difference?
I think isn't morality also? It's become so impersonal, it's become
Yeah.
so easy. You don't see the effect. If you're in the conflict zone, you see the effect. But if you're how many kilometers away, it becomes very impersonal, it becomes very easy.
And those are two important concepts. It becomes impersonal and it becomes easy. Impersonal, it's impersonal in the sense that you are not there. You don't have you're not at risk. And some people say that actually the very reason why you've got, if we said IHL gives you a right to kill, you know, the combatant's privilege, you are allowed to kill that, you're not human rights. It's you may kill that person even if that person is asleep. The reason why you can do that is because you are physically there and you are at risk yourself. So it's the idea of it's both sides, you know, that are affected.
It's a fairer contest.
It's fairer contest. So some people are saying that unless you are physically present and place yourself at risk, you cannot exercise the combatant's privilege. You cannot kill somebody on the other side based on IHL. That's the basis of IHL. There are some arguments about that. But okay, so the idea of impersonal, what was the other one that you mentioned?
It becomes too easy.
It becomes too easy. Okay, that one I want to come back to. But just on the one about impersonal, of course, what two arguments against this line is to say that if you sit watching a screen, after, in the first place, you get to know your enemy quite well, you know, especially if you're targeting somebody specifically. You are following that person, you see that person with a drip in his arm somewhere on a rooftop, and you know that's the person because we know that person has some kind of problem and he needs a drip. You follow that person for days, if not for weeks. So you get to know that person much better. And then when you release force, afterwards you actually follow that person, and you often see the person bleeding to death or whatever the case may be. And so one of the arguments is that post-traumatic stress has been picked up by drone pilots as well as by actual pilots as well. So on the impersonal part, that's a little bit of the argument on the other side. The other one about the fairness is what the Dutch, for example, said in their commission of inquiry into drones. They said, yes, that's true, it's very asymmetrical, but war is not a sporting contest. War is not a level playing field by its very nature, and that's what IHL recognizes, but that's where your morality reference may be a bit different there. But at least in terms of law, international law has always recognized that war is about subduing the enemy. And if you have the ability to move from the which one was it around? From the crossbow to the longbow, you can load 5 times faster. I think you can load. That's technology. That's a new technology that you can use, and that's an advantage that you should have. You're not required to put your arm behind your back if you're in war. But that is as far as the law is concerned. There is still a lingering. I must say, even though my position is not unlawful weapon, there's a lingering problem that I have, and that's your second point, is that it becomes so easy. If you think about traditionally the way that war works, is that there's a sort of a dam building up. There's a dam wall, and the water builds up, and then eventually the dam wall breaks, and there's a war, and then they build up the dam again, and there's a time for peace and a time for war. And you have a restoration and a time for healing, and then eventually maybe a war again. The problem with unmanned systems in general is that it becomes so easy. So you identify a particular problem and you think the world will be better off without this person, which is the phrase which my brother-in-law uses, who is in the US and in our debates about drones. He says, the world will be better off without that person. Now, if you're going to sit somewhere in Washington or in Pretoria, for that matter, or in Moscow, and you have the technical ability to decide the world will be better off without that person, that person, that person, it's not a slow building up, and you're holding back until such time as the wall breaks. it means that you have a quick fix for every problem in the world. And that's where the thing comes in, that it's too easy. It makes it so easy. And you have plausible deniability. You send in a drone. If the drone falls or whatever the case may be, there's not a pilot, and they can interrogate the pilot or something like that. You just say, it's not my drone, it's not my dog, it's not my drone that went across. So you've got plausible deniability there. So it makes it so easy. And then your approach may not be to find a political solution or a diplomatic solution. You just say the world will be a better place without, and you press that button, and it's either autonomous weapon or a drone that can be used. So with this argument, will it not make war too easy? Well, I think it remains a question. I don't think it's unlawful, but it remains a question, and for that reason, I'm also not saying that it's a position without its problems to say that drones are lawful weapons, because there's the underlying problem that we may change from a situation where the problems of the world are resolved through war, terrible as war is, to a situation which may even be worse, where it's resolved through targeted killing. So low-level, low-intensity conflict, which has no end. And so if we talk about the use ad bellum, there's also the use post bellum, the idea of war must come to an end at some point. Barack Obama, of all people, said it so well. He said all wars must come to an end. And that's really the underlying idea of the use ad bellum, is that you can engage in war if there will be an end to that as well. And drones may blur this line between war and peace, and you have low-intensity conflict, targeted killing taking the place of war, and it becomes almost a policing kind of activity. And if one state has the ability to police the world, then another state should have the ability to do it as well. And so initially you may have lower levels of violence, but it may spread over a much longer period. Sorry, you wanted to say, but that was a while ago.
You mentioned about the pilot being. We talk about the pilot, sort of his life is in danger, as opposed to the drone.
But there's no rule in international law that you must put yourself in danger. There's no explicit rule, but there is a sort of underlying kind of thing. And of course, just to latch onto the autonomous weapon system, there's also the problem with autonomous weapon systems and with drones, is that if you're not present on the battlefield from your side, and the other side, the only thing they can fight against is a robot or a drone, it's so unequal that in many cases they may say, well, we're going for the second best target, because even if we shoot down the drone, we're not killing the enemy. Now we're going for the civilians, and that is terrorism. So it may be that one of the dangers behind unmanned systems is that it encourages terrorism. So it's not so much the legal issue, I think, as the law is at the moment, but I do think it creates that sort of problem. And one cannot ignore that problem if you look at drones in general. So the use ad bellum, I don't think the law prohibits the use of drones if you meet the requirements of either self-defense or consent or Article 7. Let's then briefly look at, so that's the protection of sovereignty. Let's look at the protection of people. So if it's an armed conflict, then IHL applies and it's the lex specialis, otherwise human rights apply, as we've said before. Now, the problem with the use of drones, if drones are not unlawful weapons, but the problem with the use of drones is that it becomes easy to cross borders, as we've seen in the first place, but in the second place then, there's incentive for states to deny that they are not dealing with an armed conflict, to see the world as a whole battleground, because it becomes so easy to send things around the world. You're not sending your troops and needing to bring them back, you're just sending out a drone. If it falls, it's $1 million, and that's it, it's no problem. So it becomes so easy, and that's the theme that comes through. And it becomes very easy then for states to fall into the mode of describing anything as an armed conflict, because they want to give themselves the power to do so. So I don't think the legal categories are problematic, but it's very easy with this technology, makes it very easy to try to distort the legal categories. And that's a sort of a slogan that I've put into one of the reports, and that's picked up at some point, is to say that drones should follow the law, not the other way around. Because it's very easy once you've got drones to say, well, now we want to use these things, and we're just going to pretend that the law allows us to use them. And I think it's that tension that one needs to maintain. And that's exactly because drones are so easy to use But I would argue, and I should perhaps more or less come in for the landing, so to speak, with that, is to say that I think with drones, in fact, the question is, should we simply say the existing rules are enough? I think the existing rules are enough. We don't need new law with drones. It may be different with autonomous weapons because maybe they are inherently illegal. But with drones, I think what one should recognize is that the existing rules are enough. But I would argue that the existing rules should be applied with more care, even more care than in other cases, because it's so easy to use drones. So if there's a requirement of precaution, as we know there is in IHL, with drones you can, if you can loiter, if you can actually select your target because of the technology, then you must use that technology. You'll be measured by the technology at your disposal. So you cannot go in with a drone and go and kill 10 people and say that would have been the case if we used a manned aircraft. You are now using a drone. You now have this technology. So you'll be held to a higher standard because you have the ability to do so. So I think as far as the use of drones are concerned, we should say that the level of care by a state in using drones is a higher level because of the increased ability that drones give them. In terms of distinction, if it's true, as the drone operators say, they've got what they call bug splat analysis. They've changed the name now because it's such a terrible name. But they look at a particular target and then they make an assessment. If we come in from the north or the south or the east, will we kill 10 people? Will we kill 2 people? They do it on computers and then they say, well, civilians, we are going to kill only 2 people. If we come in from the south, then we're going to do it. With a drone, you can do that. With a F-16, you cannot do it. You've got one chance. You're flying past and you have to hit. With a drone, you can use it. And for that reason, I think the rule of distinction should still apply, of course, but you should be held to a higher level of distinction because you've got the technical ability. And the same, of course, then applies for collateral damage. Because you've got the ability to reduce collateral damage, then you must live up. It's almost like going to a GP and then going to a specialist. You're now going to a specialist and you require the specialist to exercise a higher level of care and you hold that person to a higher standard. So I think the legal framework as far as drones is concerned is in place, but in terms of its application, precisely because of these underlying concerns, which may not be strictly legal concerns, but we cannot deny them, drone operators should be held to a higher level and to a higher standard in terms of the protection of life. All right, so let's conclude then and bring it together. We have the unmanned system revolution, so to speak. Drones are used often. We're on the cusp with autonomous weapons. The existing law, I personally think, as far as drones are concerned, if it's applied in the right way, is sufficient. We don't need new law. In fact, if we're going to reopen the debate, we may lower the standards. It's very dangerous to tamper with those standards because states may then actually say it should become easier to kill and you may have a wider range. So leave the law intact, because if you start unraveling it, you may end up with a lower standard. With autonomous weapons, I'm not sure that the same applies. Autonomous weapons, I think there's a principally different issue, and that is that the human is out of the loop. And that is that machines take decisions. And I think at some point, if you read the reports, for example, the one I submitted middle of last year, I didn't know the answer. I had I simply said there must be a moratorium and there must be an international process. That international process has taken place to a large extent. We met with the CCW in March and with the ICRC and number. And what is crystallizing there is to say that technology can be used even up to some level of autonomy of the machine itself, but not to such an extent that there is no longer meaningful human control. Because if you have meaningful human control, you can still have responsibility. There's somebody in the wider loop who's responsible. If there's meaningful human control, you still have a situation where a human decides over the life or death of another human being. And the role of dignity as well. If you have the machine deciding over human beings, I think dignity, which underlies IHL and human rights, I think is at stake. And also the dignity of those using the weapons, because dignity means you take purposive decisions. But if you hand it to a computer, you no longer take purposive decisions. So I think meaningful human control, there must be a cap on the level of autonomy that can be handed over to machines. So there are really two requirements, and with that I'll indeed close. There are two requirements, I think, for the use of autonomous weapon systems. And that can be captured by saying they can be used if they're good tools. They must be tools in the sense that humans use them, there's meaningful human control, and they must be good tools. They must be better at doing what they're doing than humans would be. There's a higher level of responsibility, and they'll be held to a higher account than human beings for the very same reasons that I've mentioned with drones. If you have the technology, you'll be measured according to having that technology, and you must meet a higher standard. Then maybe we can end up in a situation where this technology can indeed, in some cases, save lives. But I would say my overall message is that technology is a tool. It should remain a tool. Technology can be used for good purposes. You can, in some cases, reduce collateral damage. You can reduce situations where you hit the wrong target. But it's a dangerous tool, and for that reason it must be under special scrutiny. Just the last comment on law enforcement. I do think there's much less room for unmanned systems in law enforcement, because the police have an obligation to protect as well. If it's unmanned system, there's not a police officer to help anybody who may be in a demonstration, run underfoot by people and so on. But with autonomous weapon systems as well, I think there's much less room for higher levels of autonomy in law enforcement. And the last example, I mentioned this in the meeting before, is, say, imagine Boko Haram. I think, 27 or so of the girls came out now, but say there are 100 of them in a particular room, and there are 10 hostage takers, and you've got 10 snipers who are trained on these hostage takers. So obviously you want to protect the girls, you don't care about the hostage takers. They pose a direct threat, and you can take them out. But you don't have a clear shot between all 10 of these people. And they can't shout to each other to say, okay, now it's fine, and then they shoot. If one of them shoots when he's got a clear shot, then the other 9 hostage takers may actually cause a lot of damage. So imagine that you can link them with a computer, and all the snipers sit there, they train their weapons on the hostage takers. They pull the trigger, but the trigger doesn't activate the bullet until such time as the computer has synchronized all of it. And when all 10 of them have a clean shot, then they shoot those 10 people at the same time. Now, I would say that's a good use of technology. Anybody who argues against that, I think, is going to end up with a lot of resistance if you're saying you can't use such technology. Now, to me, that's a good example in a law enforcement context, except if you see that as a non-conflict, of course. But even if you assume this is a typical hostage-taking situation in law enforcement, where technology at a certain point can actually help you to achieve certain goals. But if the technology becomes too much, if it's no more, there's meaningful control, because the individual snipers pull the trigger, they decide that person will die. It's a human taking that decision. The computer only helps you to do it better. But if it's beyond a certain point, if you have a computer that goes out and decides 10 people must be killed on a certain battlefield and goes around and decides who these 10 people are, then I think you've lost meaningful human control. And that's where I would think it's a very complicated issue. And there's no, I don't have even if I had another hour, I can't give you this is what a number of us are working on now, is to try to define what are the elements of meaningful human control. How do you define meaningful human control? It will have a lot to do with space, that you say it's in a desert or in underwater. It will have a lot to do with time, how long after the decision to release force is the force actually released. It will have a lot to do with those sort of things. But meaningful human control seems to me the situation as far as autonomous weapons are concerned, where you say up to a certain point, autonomous weapons can enhance our autonomy. Beyond a certain point, it's not worth having this. Even if potentially you can save life with those sort of things, it's just not worth having that. I fear that's all that I have time for, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christoph. We have still a few minutes for